Welcome back to Module 5, which is on space and missiles. In this video, Richard Leone will be speaking to John Borry and Pavel Potwig of UNIDIR. In the video, you will also see a number of short explanatory films, including from UNIDIR on multilateral efforts and technical capabilities to reduce risks associated with the booming space business, and some original voices by experts, diplomats, and officials attending a 2018 conference on space security that UNIDIR helped to organize. But first, a fascinating interview of Richard Leone with John Borry on space issues.
Dr. John Borry from UNIDIR. And he's very kindly agreed to talk to us about space, the final frontier. So perhaps if we could start, John, if you just tell us a bit, why is space a disarmament issue? Why do we even talk about space and disarmament?
Well, space has been a security issue since the 50s when the Soviet Union launched the first artificial satellite, Sputnik. And throughout the Cold War, the sort of space domain was important, both because it was part of the wider Cold War arms race, and that there was a lot of prestige to be seen as the most technically advanced. And increasingly over the course of the Cold War, space increased in strategic importance, initially for communications, but as time went by also for satellite observation and reconnaissance. And then satellites became critical parts of the command and control infrastructure of the superpowers, in particular, the United States and the Soviet Union, and indeed became integral, particularly in the US case, to its nuclear command and control infrastructure in order to be able to relay orders to, for example, nuclear missile submarines at sea, or communicate with bombers, or indeed maintain communication between leaders and in the White House and elsewhere, and military leaders and bunkers and places like that. And space is even more important today because the commercial value of space has increased exponentially. And to give you an idea of this, in 2008, there were only a few countries actually launching space objects, and one organization, which was the European Union. But only 9 years later, in 2017, there were more than 25. And the value of the space economy has more than doubled in that time. It's, I think, in 2017 was worth about $350 billion, whereas 2008 it had been worth about $190 billion. So space is becoming more important, and we're seeing more of these kind of actors operating in space who are not representing nation states. They are trying to make a buck. And there's increasing concern that the activities of leading military powers could actually endanger those commercial activities. For example, space debris created by anti-satellite missile tests could destroy satellites and bring them down or cause collisions, and that would be very expensive and very inconvenient, and could deny the use of space to everybody for some time. So all of these sorts of things are contributing to increasing concern about space. And now that we've seen increasing strategic tensions between the US and Russia and China in particular, who are the leading space powers, we're really beginning to now see the formation of space forces, military commands that are tasked with treating space as a military domain. And we're seeing doctrines and capabilities being developed which could be used in conflict. And those are not only ground-based anti-satellite weapons, but we're also seeing co-orbital drones, if you like, satellites that can maneuver in orbit around, near, or into other satellites, which is obviously of concern. And we've, in many years, for many years now, been seeing increasing cyber and electronic hacking and attacks on space objects of various kinds. So space, unfortunately, has really arrived as a security issue, but the international community at the moment is, if we put it charitably, not tremendously effective right now in responding to that.
So what have the responses been so far then? You mentioned it's been, space has been intimately connected with security concerns for many years. What's the current sort of legal structure surrounding the use of space or the military use of space?
Well, way back in 1967, there was a treaty negotiated, the Outer Space Treaty, and that prohibits the placement of weapons of mass destruction in space. And during the Cold War, there were very serious concerns that nuclear weapons might be put in space. But it didn't prevent the overt militarization of space. And from the late 1970s, early 1980s, you saw the emergence of what's called PAROS, not a Greek island, but the prevention of an arms race in outer space. And this is indeed one of the 4 core items on the agenda of the Conference on Disarmament. But in actual fact, despite achieving this agenda item, states have never really been able to agree on how to tackle PAROS. And there are 2 broad schools of thought. One school of thought is you need legally binding instruments of various kinds which will prohibit certain kinds of activity or capability in space. And one example of this would be the proposals by China and Russia over many years for a treaty on the prohibition of placement of weapons in space, the so-called PPWT. But the other school of thought is, and one that's many Western countries, the United States in particular, but other countries too, subscribe to, which is it's actually very difficult to apply these sorts of arms control approaches to space. And what's really important is the way that actors in space behave, because really any object with mass in space, in the absence of gravity, is a weapon, anything with mass at all. So if everything is dual use, then it doesn't make much sense to talk about weapons. And this school of thought is much more concerned with trying to develop confidence-building measures and norms of responsible behaviour about the way that space would be used. And this remains, 40 years after PAROS emerged as a sort of approach, this is still pretty much largely, these are the 2 schools of thought on the subject.
But are these two schools mutually exclusive? Could you not pursue both the legally binding approach as well as confidence building measures and codes of conduct and so on?
In principle, they're not mutually exclusive, but in practice, they tended to be, because states have tended to emphasize their approach to the exclusion of the other, or in some cases to frame, if you like, kind of soft law or norms of behavior as weaker than legally binding rules, which is not really a very apt way, my colleagues and I believe, to think about these issues.
Looking a little bit further ahead then, you mentioned earlier on that the number of countries or actors that are involved in space is growing quite rapidly, especially over the last few years. You also mentioned that perhaps the international community is not really handling this issue very well. Do you think that the growing number of countries and other actors involved and with a stake in, now largely a commercial stake in space, you think there'll be more appetite and more pressure to make progress multilaterally on this kind of issue?
Well, there certainly is. I mean, the sense that we get from the commercial sector operating in space is, they want to make a buck. They're spending a lot of money, investing a lot of money into capabilities and operations in space that would, be seriously endangered by any kind of form of conflict that broke out in space or serious interference in their operations. And so there's certainly an appetite there for clear rules of the road, if you like, in terms of what is acceptable behavior in space. If you're operating a $100 million telecommunications satellite, you don't want other countries maneuvering objects very, very close to your expensive asset, without clearing that with you first, for example, or at least notifying you. And these kinds of things, we don't have these kind of rules at the moment. And the future path in terms of improving space security is probably going to be through this soft normative route of states figuring out what the stakes are, what it's in their mutual interests to be pursuing. For example, notifying each other of close orbital maneuvers, developing guidelines so that if they have to test ground-launched anti-satellite weapons, and only 4 states have, thankfully, that they do their utmost not to create debris, because that endangers everything and everyone in orbit. And that they think about other kinds of arrangement. For example, developing their national space policies and doctrines, releasing public information about this so that we can properly contextualize their national activities in space, which is important because technical space situational awareness capabilities, the ability to track objects in orbit, is actually rapidly improving. And a lot of that capability is actually being spearheaded by the commercial sector for commercial reasons. So all of this would complement each other, and that could build confidence in time for harder kind of security type agreements.
All right. And I guess any of our course participants who'd like some more information about space or wants to know more about what UNIDIR is doing can come and knock on your door, or at least on your email.
Absolutely.
Biggest hurdle is the political issues that are coming in the way of establishing the rules of the road. We have a few established rules of the road, whether it is in terms of legal measures or even soft law in terms of code of conduct and so on and so forth. But I think there are far too many expansive interpretation of those measures, and therefore we need something new. And how do we go about building that? At a time when there is a larger geopolitical transformation taking place, I think it's becoming much harder to develop even a soft law in form of a political commitment, in the form of a code of conduct. So that is going to be a huge issue because of the political issues. The fact that the major powers, major spacefaring powers, cannot come to a consensus, cannot come to an agreement on what are the challenges or even what are the possible ways of finding a solution. I think it's a political issue, not because the states do not understand what are the real challenges, whether it is in terms of arms race. So you need to prevent arms race in outer space. So there are certain measures that we have been talking about. One good measure is the prevention of arms race in outer space, PAROS. So that's a good measure that we have been talking about, but there has been no meaningful discussion within the UN for the last 20 years. Second, you have the GGE model, but that's a group of governmental experts within the UN. But again, the problem is the UN recommendations are mere recommendations. Those are only suggestions in how to go about things. They don't have a binding effect. You can make them somewhat more binding and make them political commitments from states. For instance, if some of the recommendations are taken up as UN Security Council resolutions, for instance, then that could get some sort of a larger support beyond the 15 members of the UNGG, for instance. So that's one way to tackle the UNGG recommendations and make it somewhat more binding, more effective. But I think at the end of the day, you can find these technical ways to deal with some of these problems. But I think the fact that, for instance, you have on any international security issue, you have broadly two schools of thought. One school is led by the Russia-China group, and the other one is the Western group led by the US. And the two groups don't meet eye to eye. They don't come to the same page, and they said that, okay, these are the issues. This is how we need to go about this. We need to at least work on a set of lowest denominator kind of thing. These are the lowest set of parameters that we need to address before the outer space goes completely haywire. And I'm not too clear, I'm not too sure, are we waiting for one major catastrophe to happen in outer space that makes it actually unusable or non-usable for states, and then to realize, okay, we should have done something about these issues for secure and continued access to outer space is an important issue. But are we waiting for that kind of a moment to happen and then realize that we should all work together?
For us, space security first and foremost means a non-weaponization of outer space. And we want to keep the peaceful nature of outer space forever, because nowadays, with the advancement of technology, outer space is having an impact on everybody's daily life. So we want to keep it peaceful. And that is the reason why China and Russia have made the proposal that we need to negotiate a treaty like a PPWT, so that we can really come up with a legally binding international instrument that prevent the weaponization of outer space. As for this conference, China is a sponsor of this annual event for many years. So naturally, we want to see a very substantive discussion at the conference, so that people can have a good understanding of each other's position. And also, especially for this year, this conference is particularly important, as I mentioned in my statement in the conference, that there are so many activities in the UN that are going on, like the UNDC is talking about TCBM, and the Conference on Disarmament has established a subsidiary body group and to talk about prevention of an arms race in outer space. And also we're going to have a GGE in the UN itself. So having this substantive and wide-ranging discussion will be helpful to all the upcoming discussions. So we put a lot of importance to this annual event.
I come from a small country, Sierra Leone. It does not have space technology, but it has benefited from the use of space technology, and it does appreciate the importance of space technology for its development or for responding to natural disasters or conflicts, as the case may be. The good thing about the United Nations is that even the smallest countries have a voice in the multilateral dialogue. And countries such as Sierra Leone should not look at the whole question of space and say, what's there for me? I have nothing to contribute. It should think about the impact that it could have on their development and could use that opportunity to make sure that during the intergovernmental forum, it can make a point and that could contribute to try to secure space so that it would be there for the use of the poorest of the countries.
We're here talking to Pavel Podvik at UNIDIR. Pavel, thanks very much for joining us for this little video. We're going to talk about missiles. And you're the man who knows all about missiles. So perhaps you could start by telling our participants, what do we mean by missiles? What is a missile? What are the different kinds of missiles and missile systems?
Missiles actually, it's a fairly broad category, and if you try to define it, then I guess the better definition would be that this is an uncrewed, guided weapon delivery vehicle. And normally, when people talk about missiles, they mean ballistic missiles, but there are other types of missiles as well. For example, cruise missiles or some drones could be considered missiles. Or we have exotic things like hypersonic glide vehicles that also could be in that category. What makes missiles different from other delivery systems is, at least in the early days, they have this distinct advantage of being able to deliver their strike very quickly to large distances. And unlike bombers, they were invulnerable to air defenses, so they could penetrate air defense. Just to put it in perspective, for example, if we're talking about intercontinental distances of the order of 10,000 kilometers, then a bomber would require 10, 12, 14 hours to get to its target, and the missile could cover that distance in about 25, 30 minutes. So there is a significant difference here. Another advantage of missiles is that you can launch your strike from your own territory. You don't have to get close to the target. So you are basically firing from safety of your own state. And if you could build a long-range missile, then that means you could project your power or defend yourself from threats that are very far away from your country. And that definitely something that missiles, this is definitely the area where missiles have a distinct advantage. Another reason why missiles sort of occupy their own category in the international security discussion is that they're very firmly associated with weapons of mass destruction. And the reason for that is that, especially for ballistic missiles, if you try to build a missile that would have a fairly long range, then assuring that that missile is accurate enough is actually very difficult, and it is still difficult. That very much makes it unreasonable to use missiles, especially long-range missiles, with conventional payloads because they just don't have the accuracy that would be sufficient to any particular military purpose. However, missiles could still be used, and they have been used, in fact, with conventional payloads, but largely as weapons of intimidation or terror. And actually, you can look at the very first use of missiles back in during the World War II, when Nazi Germany used used the very first cruise and ballistic missiles against Britain. So that association with weapons of mass destruction is definitely one of the reasons that missiles are getting attention. The situation is changing as far as accuracy is concerned, and missiles are getting more accurate, especially shorter range missiles, especially cruise missiles and things like drones. And we've seen they were used in a number of conflicts. But nevertheless, it's still, when you get to the intercontinental ranges, to very long ranges, then they are still very firmly considered to be means of nuclear weapon delivery. The effort to curb the proliferation of missiles to somehow contain the spread of missile technologies began in the early days, and in the 80s, a group of states launched this international regime, Missile Technology Control Regime, or MTCR, that actually is designed to contain the spread of the technologies at the time, and it was largely the proliferation of technology from the holders, from the major missile producers to other states that was considered to be the main threat to international security. And to a large extent, that regime was successful in the sense that there are 30 plus states that participate in the regime, and there are a number of others, major missile producers that follow the guidelines voluntarily. On the other hand, we have now seen that even though it is still rocket science, it's still a difficult technical enterprise, we've seen a number of states developing their own indigenous missile technologies, and that we've seen states developing ballistic missiles, and that is certainly true for cruise missiles as well. And in fact, we've seen private companies being in the space launch business, and some of those space launchers actually are very close to true ICBMs. And so we've seen, we've already seen, and we will probably see in the future, that the technological barriers are eroding, and that's definitely something that the international community should pay attention to. Another mechanism that regulates ballistic missiles is the Hague Code of Conduct. That is also a voluntary mechanism, and it commits its members to providing greater transparency in regarding their ballistic missiles program. For example, the members commit to provide notifications of their ballistic missile launches and their space launches, and also provide annual declaration of their ballistic missile activities. The HCOC is not an export control measure. It is a transparency and confidence building mechanism, and it has a greater participation than MTCR, although it's not universal yet. But nevertheless, it is open for new participants, and this is one of the mechanisms that actually can be a building block of a regime that would at least provide transparency in the ballistic missile field. Proliferation of missile technologies to new states is not the only problem that we see today. We also see development of new types of missiles, new types of weapon delivery systems in states like Russia or the United States or China, and we can see that process actually, if not accelerating, but at least progressing further and further. And some of these technologies are fairly exotic. For example, there is a lot of attention these days to what is called the hypersonic missiles, and this is another category of missiles. And but normally these are what is called hypersonic glide vehicles, which operate sort of almost like a missile, but with a sort of the delivery vehicle travels through the atmosphere. The idea is that it would deliver its strike faster, and it could circumvent missile defenses. So we are back to where the missiles actually started. The problem with this kind of development is not necessarily that we will see a massive deployment of this kind of gliders. The problem, of course, is that these systems are not included in any of the current arms control agreements, and therefore their developments are not constrained by any understanding between the states that develop them. These are still, in my view, systems that provide a very niche capabilities, and we will not see a massive deployment of hypersonic gliders. But they could be enough of a factor that would destabilize the traditional arms control process, or at least very will complicate it in a very significant way. So we will see that development in the near future. When we talk about missiles, I think it is also very important to talk about missile defense, because again, if we look at the origins of the technology and its importance for strategic competition and for military operations, the idea, one of the characteristics of a missile is that it is not it cannot be intercepted by traditional air defenses. And this is why we've seen from the very early days, we've seen an effort to build defense against missiles. And this effort actually goes back to the 50s, and it's still going on. The hope is that that one day one could build a missile defense that could protect the state from a missile strike. The problem, of course, is that, and it is very well known, is that it's very much impossible to build a missile defense that would be able to pose any serious threat to or that could counter any serious missile attack, or even a non-serious missile attack, even an attack with a single missile or a few missiles. There is virtually impossible to build a defense that could provide you with a sufficient guarantee of protection. Nevertheless, the effort continues. The problem with missile defense is that it encourages the development of new missiles, and this is the dynamic that we've seen in the past, in the 60s and then in the 80s. You see the kind of waves of enthusiasm about defenses. But the problem is that missile defense can work, but it can only work against missiles that don't exist. Once missile defense considers the actual missiles that are there that it is supposed to counter, then politician, any military planner would quickly realize that actual missile defense so far is no protection. But the problem is that by that time you have more missiles around, and that cycle could continue again and again. And right now we are probably in that cycle where people are pushing for more defenses, but since there are no missiles out there that these defenses would have to counter in a serious way, we see that there is still a bit of enthusiasm about missile defense capabilities.
For diplomats working in Geneva, is there any processes here? Are there any moves to introduce new treaties or new control measures on missiles? What's happening in multilateral diplomacy? Anything or nothing?
In terms of discussions that are happening in Geneva, I guess the closest that it gets to the issues related to missiles is the discussion about deployment of weapons in space that are conducted in the framework of the Conference on Disarmament. And the link is not entirely direct, but there is a link with missile defense, because the discussion of weaponization of space has to deal with that issue of missile defenses and their capabilities to target satellites. And that has been a contentious issue, and it probably will be a contentious issue throughout that discussion.
This concludes the video for Module 5 on space and missiles. Next up is the final video of this disarmament orientation course. This will be on information and communications technology, on cyber and lethal autonomous weapons. So please join us there.